All right, so we're back doing a part two, continuing right from where we left off on this. Does free will exist? Sapolsky versus Huemer. So far, it's just been setting up the terms and giving the kind of argument from Sapolsky about how the past has some influence on it. So he's still in the middle of it. We're in the middle of comments over here from Joe Schmidt and Dr. Taylor Sire. Very interesting. So we're jumping right back.
Another place to maybe mention the degrees of freedom thing. It might be that Robert Harris has no freedom. It's totally eradicated by his circumstances. Like he just never becomes a morally responsible agent. But it might be that, he played some role himself and maybe to a lesser extent shaped his character, had some responsibility for his choices. There's room for that kind of mitigated approach. So that's what I would say about cases like the one Sapolsky's referring to here.
I don't know all the details about the specific case that you mentioned, but like that's the approach that I would be inclined to take as well for a lot of these cases. I do think it's very implausible to say that they have as much control as someone who is like like a neurotypical agent like you and me and so on.
Yeah.
I think it's far too hasty to then go on to say that no control at all or something like that, or no free will at all. Like it's just we cannot praise or blame in any way, shape.
Yeah, but I don't think that Sapolsky thinks that that we don't have control in the sense that they are talking about. This is something I was talking about with someone in the comments in a previous video. I don't think that's really the issue about control. That's not the issue. Some people have better control, other people have worse control. His point is about how did you get that way? Whether you're responsible.
There's just I just find that implausible. But again, I'm not saying that for every single case. I mean, sometimes people have like a literal like hemorrhage in their brain or like some sort of cancerous growth, which is like pressing on something and like genuinely making them go.
By the way, I've already said in previous places that I sort of started off with hardcore libertarian intuitions and gradually kind of became more friendly to compatibilism over time. Like most philosophers have thought about this, you think there's really no way out of it. I don't work on these issues though, and I've always secretly hoped maybe there would be a cool libertarian view of free will coming along someday. Haven't seen it ever, but I don't know about Huemer's view. I think I've actually maybe know something about his view. Actually, now that I think about it, but not in too much detail. So, yeah, I'm not coming at this from the point of view of trying to grind my axe or see which view is right, but what are the arguments and what is Sapolsky's argument supposed to be? That's what I'm interested in. I see a lot of philosophers getting mad that he doesn't take philosophers seriously. I sort of think that, a lot of people don't like compatibilism. It's as though you were, a neuroscientist and then you found out that illusionism was the dominant theory of consciousness amongst philosophers. You'd be like, whoa, philosophers are nuts then, I guess. At least casually before you got too into all the debates. I mean, by the way, illusionism is not the dominant view in philosophy of mind and consciousness. It's an outlier view, to be sure. So it's not like the free will case where the kind of view which seems strange is the dominant view. Compatibilism. Yeah, anyway, okay, so let's go ahead and let them continue.
Like insane and then go like shoot up a place or something. Like that's a case where it might very well be plausible that they have no control whatsoever.
Right.
But in some of these cases where it's like a long drawn out childhood and various other kind of decision points that the person was partially shaping their character in certain ways and partially not, like it seems plausible, at least to me.
Yeah, I know I said I'd let them go on, but it just seems like they're totally missing the point. The issue is not about control. It's about how you got to have the control you have. And is it in such a way that you should count as responsible for having that level of control?
They will indeed have less control, but that doesn't mean no control.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a good point.
Back. You've just made a decision which you attribute to the free will, and part of what occurred instead was your fetal life. What happened when you were a fetus? If your mother was highly stressed during your fetal life, and thus you were exposed to high levels of her stress hormones, that's going to change the functioning of your brain in adulthood, having all sorts of things to do with how readily you see threat, how prone you are to anxiety, a finding that should have people rioting at the barricades. It's so outrageous. Imaging techniques have got to the point where you could image a fetal brain, and by the time you're a third trimester fetus, the socioeconomic status of your parents, of your mother, is already influencing the size of your brain. But even further back, genes don't determine anything, but genes modulate circumstance. Here's a totally cool one. There's a gene having to do with the vasopressin receptor, and if you have one particular version of it, it doesn't change male behavior normally, but if you are in a stable monogamous relationship, it makes you decrease the distance that you stand between you and someone else who seems sexually attractive. You stop remembering that you're in a monogamous relationship. You're more likely to do that. But further back, culture like 2 generations ago, in China, half the country are rice farmers and develop collectivist cultures. Half are wheat farmers and develop individualist cultures. And if your grandparents were from either of those backgrounds, that influences the likelihood of you having invented something and filing for a patent, you having gotten a divorce or remained steadily in a relationship for your whole lifetime. But further back than 2 generations, look at somebody now and they make a decision where we would assess how xenophobic are they being about immigrants. And part of what goes into it is 400 years ago, what was the infectious disease load of their culture? Because if they descended from those people who had to worry about how infectious outsiders were, they've created, and you were raised in, a culture that was more xenophobic. But it goes even further back. How about 50,000 years? This amazing feature that has been found in indigenous populations all over Earth, which is the further your ancestors migrated from Africa, the more likely you are to have a gene variant related to novelty seeking. I mean, at some point, 50,000 years ago, a bunch of people got to Siberia and said, this looks cool, great place to raise kids. And others said, wow, look at that, there's a land bridge, let's see what Alaska is about. And 50,000 years later, that's reflected in differences in gene frequencies. So why did the person do what they did that they might attribute to free will? Because of what came a second before and an hour before and a million years and everything in between. Now, the critical reason why this doesn't free will harps to something that Mike has brought up, which is like a wonderful word. He has like appropriately condemned behaviorists, 20th century behaviorists, by saying that they were overconfident in describing like how they could explain everything. And that was a very polite term. They were do not trust anyone who says this gene explains everything. Or,
by the way, about behaviorism, they may have been overconfident, but it is amazing how far you can get with just behaviorism. You can't get all the way, maybe, but you'd be surprised. And that's really a surprising thing. But anyway.
This part of the brain explains everything, or this hormone, or this cultural feature, anything. Don't believe them because they're not going to explain anything with that, and that's not how you disprove free will. And it's not even that put all these disciplines together and you plug all the holes. They're not all different disciplines. They're all the same discipline. If you were talking about genes, by definition, you're talking about evolution. And you're talking about the proteins those genes code for and how they constructed your brain this morning. If you were talking about fetal life, you were talking about how your pregnant mother was treated in her culture that produced her stress hormone levels, and thus what sort of brain you would have as an adult. And I think when you put all these pieces together, just to be like really subtle and not in your face, I think the result is there is no room. It is a seamless arc of biological influences interacting with environmental influences that leave no room for free will whatsoever. So that's my like song and dance.
Okay.
Okay. Any comments on that last little bit that leaves no room whatsoever for free will?
I guess the way that Sapolsky sort of summarizes just kind of reinforces our point that he is generalizing from a lot of particular cases and only really to the conclusion, like all that he's really seeing himself is arguing for is the conclusion that because of these biological factors, everything we do is influenced by stuff that was not to us. Does that amount to determinism? Well, I'd say no. I think all the philosophers who you might ask would also say no. But also, it's not clear that he's given enough reason to accept that conclusion anyway. So that's sort of my summary response.
Yeah, I agree. We haven't shown that determinism is the case. Even if we have, he has simply assumed incompatibilism, which is another major thing, right? So like, there's this huge area of the free will debate that we're just like assuming is not the case, and indeed it's a majority position, as you mentioned.
Yeah, but how guys, so can we hear an argument or an account of how it is that the compatibilist is going to address this point about becoming the kind of person that you are? I think that's what Huemer is going to talk about. So let's talk about self-shaping choices or something. Yeah, but okay.
We already covered the points about like case generalization and whatnot. So yeah. I think that suffices for Dr. Sapolsky's opening statement. And now for the very juicy opening statement of Dr. Michael Huemer. So before we get into that, I did just want to emphasize, even though I'm going to be very critical of Michael Huemer going on, I very much appreciate his work. He's been on my channel. He's done a massive service to public philosophy by making all these appearances on YouTube channels and podcasts. His books are excellent, and I highly recommend that everyone in my audience pick them up, especially Knowledge, Reality, and Value. I would hold it up, but I left it at my dorm room at Princeton. So it's a very excellent Yes, it's a very excellent introduction to philosophy. It's my favorite. If/when I go on to teach philosophy courses, I'm going to be using this one as an intro probably. So I very much recommend it. Okay, so now that I've said
Interesting.
nice things about humor, I've covered my bases, and now I can
Can I
be
say one nice thing too?
yes, but now I can be
So,
ruthlessly critical.
yeah.
Go on.
I love that book too, and I don't use it when I teach Intro to Philosophy, but I always recommend it as a book for my students if they want an introduction to philosophy. I teach a Intro to Philosophy course at Stanford that's science fiction themed, and
Mm.
when we get to free will, I show the movie Minority Report, and Mike Huemer has written a really nice piece on free will and determinism in the movie Minority Report, and so we read that and talk about free will and determinism, discussing Huemer's work. So I appreciate his work too, and love that he's doing this kind of thing on
Someday I want to learn how to be a cool philosophy professor that uses science fiction. But yeah, cool.
YouTube for more access for more people.
This is my understanding of the issue. The free will thesis holds that we sometimes have alternative possibilities available to us, and it is up to us which is realized. So, meaning that there's more than one thing that you can do, and you have control over what you do. Hard determinism, so I will refer to this as determinism. Philosophers distinguish between hard and soft determinism, but I'm not going to talk about soft determinism because it's not Sapolsky's view. So hard determinism is a view that there's only ever one possibility, which is determined by the laws of nature and the initial conditions of whatever system we're talking about. And so a person doesn't have multiple things that they can do.
So first, the terminology, hard and soft determinism, it's worth flagging that almost no one in philosophy uses that terminology anymore. Sometimes teaching old papers in the free will debate, we have to refer to them because they used to be more common. But yeah, hard determinism is something like determinism is true and we don't have free will, and maybe because of determinism. Soft determinism was a sort of old version of compatibilism, which was compatibilism plus the thesis that determinism is true. But nowadays, many compatibilists, the vast majority of them, don't take a stand on whether or not determinism is true. They just think if determinism is true, that wouldn't necessarily rule out free will because those things are compatible. Because a lot of interpretations of quantum physics in particular is indeterministic. It seems safer if you're a philosopher and not a scientist to not take a scientific empirically falsifiable thesis on board that you don't have to. So as long as indeterminism is no threat to free will, compatibilists can be what they're sometimes called
I mean, there's a different sense of determinism in which quantum mechanics is deterministic at the mathematical level, but certainly at the we do the measurement level, it's not.
Compatibilists, they think free will is compatible with determinism and with indeterminism. So I'll just flag that. When Huemer says he's not going to talk about soft determinism, he's right. He's not really going to talk about those kinds of compatibilist views, but he's not going to talk about other super compatibilist views either.
Yeah, exactly. And major caution for the audience here. As Huemer is using free will, right? He seems to be using it to refer to having both leeway freedom and sourcehood freedom, okay? As he is using free will here, you have to have leeway freedom, so you have to have alternative possibilities open to you. You could have done otherwise on a given occasion of acting. And it has to be up to you which of the relevant alternative possibilities you go down, basically. So he is using free will to refer to both leeway freedom and sourcehood freedom. And I just want to highlight that is slightly different than at least one major usage of free will in the free will literature that we were talking about earlier, which is simply the ability to control our actions in a way needed to be morally responsible for them. And when we define it that way, we don't...
It sounds like the assumption is that that's what's required for that. So
sort of prejudice the issue, as it were. We don't kind of assume that sort of free will requires leeway or requires sourcehood or what have you. So I just want to highlight that for the audience. Be very, very careful.
Yeah, he really is going to emphasize the leeway component. He does talk a little bit about sourcehood too, but he does think that leeway freedom is necessary for moral responsibility, and that's something that we might call into question in a little bit.
Yes. Okay. At the very least, we will call into question his arguments for that thesis.
I'll do both.
Okay, yes.
So I'm going to argue that hard determinism is insane, and also it's self-defeating. And what I mean by it being insane is basically that it conflicts with the entire rest of your belief system, and it conflicts with the practices of any normal person in everyday life. Okay, and why do I say this? First to note is the existence of alternative possibilities is conceptually tied to many other kinds of judgments that we make. So whenever you say that a person should do something, it seems like you're presupposing that they have more than one alternative. Or if you try to give a reason for doing something, if you say that there's reason to do something, then it seems like you're also assuming that there's more than one thing that could be done. If you talk about somebody acting rightly or wrongly, also seems to presuppose that there are alternatives.
All right, so we are going to go through each of these in turn. The claim that alternative possibilities are conceptually tied to these normative judgments about what you should do, what you have reason to do, and whether someone acted rightly or wrongly. So let's start with judgments about some subject S should do some action A. Does that imply the presence of alternative possibilities open to the subject S? That's the question that we're going to investigate that here. So I'll turn it over to you, Taylor, to offer your thoughts on whether or not should judgments require the presence of alternative possibilities.
I guess simply, I don't think that that is the case. I guess I think it very well could be that a person should do something in some sense, regardless of whether they have alternatives. I think perhaps even regardless of whether they even could consider any alternatives. So something that's going to come up a lot in my response to these reasons for thinking that hard determinism is completely insane is that I think where Huemer says alternative possibilities are required, and he means genuine metaphysical openness, like real leeway. I think all that's really required is something like considering otherwise, or something like epistemic alternative possibilities, where you're deliberating among courses of action that you, at least from your point of view, consider to be live options, even if one of those is sort of kind of lit up as the actual future, given the way things were 1,000 years ago and together with the laws of nature. As long as you don't know that, you could be deliberating from among what you take to be genuinely available alternatives, and you end up doing the thing that you were determined to do for some reason, and you chose that rather than something else, even though you couldn't, metaphysically speaking, you couldn't have done otherwise. I think that's all possible, and that's going to undermine a lot of Huemer's reasons here.
Yeah, that's all possible, but Huemer's. But okay, so wait, I was talking about Huemer, not Sapolsky. Right. So would that really count? I mean, that's the soft compatibilism, soft determinism, compatibilism that Huemer doesn't want to discuss. So as long as you have his framework in mind, then yeah, that doesn't really count as free will. I think that that's the kind of control that people like Dennett and compatibilists and everybody else want to highlight, that there is this fully determined thing going on in there that seemingly is selecting between live options, even though it's fully determined to end up in one outcome. But that's what it means to have control and free will in this sense, according to the compatibilists.
If I'm right about that. But even here, like, and I know you're going to probably say more about this, Joe, I think, could it be the case that even if I don't even consider, right, reasons to do otherwise, whether it's even possible for me to do otherwise, could it still be that I should do something? Well, I think, yeah, there are lots of times where I think I'm doing what I should be doing, especially morally speaking. I'm doing what I morally ought to be doing, and I never deliberate about it. I don't take myself to have alternatives, right? Like, I'm not a great person. I have flaws, but sometimes I just do what I ought to do because I know that's what I ought to do, and it has no bearing on whether I should do it, whether I could have done otherwise. So that's my sort of initial thought.
Yeah, like a mother. We can suppose
yeah, but the thought of Huemer is that there's an ought implies can sort of thing, that if you ought to do it, then you can do it. So if you can't do it, then you shouldn't do it. So if you're like, there's no sense in which you could have done something different, then what sense is there to say that you should have done it? Because to say you should have done it implies that you might not have, I think, is what Huemer's trying to say.
Are just so psychologically constituted that they genuinely just could not have done otherwise than care for their children in a particular situation. And maybe they didn't even, they're just so constituted that it doesn't even cross their mind. They don't even consider doing otherwise. But it still seems like, yeah, they should care for their children in that instance. And they do indeed go on to do it. So yeah, it just seems really implausible to me that these sorts of normative judgments require alternative possibilities. And in fact, you and I mean, to rebut Huemer's argument here, we actually don't even need to make that stronger claim. All we need to say is that you and I are not conceptually confused in what we've just said, right? All we have said, it's at least we have not just contradicted ourselves or something like that by making these judgments. We don't even have to say these judgments are in fact correct, even though they strike us as very, very plausible. These judgments about, yeah, the mother should indeed care for her children, even though she's psychologically constituted so that she is kind of, that's the inevitable thing that's going to happen. She can't do otherwise. All we need is that in saying that, we are not conceptually confused. And I think that's pretty clear, even if we're mistaken in our judgments, which I don't think we are. Yeah, so that's another thing. But okay, I just wanted to get to some potential counterexamples to this. I mean, we already went through some, but here are some others. To Huemer's claim that these should judgments imply the presence of alternative possibilities. So one is from major shout out to Tom Kelly, who's an amazing professor of mine at Princeton. He gives the following example with which he is sympathetic. I don't claim he thinks that this is a definite counterexample, but he basically says, suppose you're mountain climbing alone in a deserted area and you become trapped in a crevice by a large unmovable boulder that's basically pinning your arm down. Now, to make it out alive, you need to use the axe on your belt to hack off your arm and free yourself, okay? Now, you recognize that this is in your best interest, that it would be incredibly good if you did it and incredibly bad if you didn't, since you'd leave behind a wife, several young kids, grad students, and many others whom you serve. Nevertheless, you're so queasy about this sort of thing that your psychology simply prevents you from being able to hack off your arm. Intuitively, says Kelly, it's still true that you should hack off your arm, even though that's not a real alternative course of action open to you. So what follows from that is that should judgments don't presuppose alternative possibilities. And at the very least, someone who makes that judgment doesn't seem conceptually confused, and so normative judgments like these don't conceptually imply alternative possibilities, contrary to what Huemer at least appears to say.
So you should hack off your arm, even though you're not psychologically just like able to do it. But shouldn't you then say in that case that if you should hack off your arm, then you should be the sort of person who's psychologically capable of doing it? That's really what you're saying, which maybe is something that they could have done. Interesting, though. Okay, let's continue on.
Now, Kelly's case, if successful, is actually a counterexample both to the principle that should or ought implies can, and the and a counterexample to the principle that ought implies the presence of alternative possibilities. So those are different. Because, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So that's one case. And then the second case is from Nomi Arpali in her book Merit, Meaning, and Human Bondage. She gives the example of where you kind of step on the brakes to avoid hitting a pedestrian, and in doing so, she says, it seems you're responding to overwhelming prudential and moral reason. And suppose further that kind of just given your psychological and physical constitution, you couldn't have done otherwise. Like you're just so constituted to be so hardwired into those considerations that you just immediately press the brakes and you respond to that, and you couldn't have done otherwise. Now, according to Arpali, she says you are pushed to action by the very fact that you have these overwhelming reasons. Yet we do not deny that you ought, morally and prudentially, to step on your brakes. And of course, this is not a counterexample to the principle that ought implies can, since it's a case in which someone ought to do something and actually does the thing, and so clearly can do it, right? But if successful, it is a counterexample to the claim that ought implies the presence of alternative possibilities open to the subject. Right. Okay. So that's kind of my take on that. I don't know if you have any things to add.
I would say they're linked because of the thing about whether you can have alternate possibilities. So whether you should have done it is going to be related to whether you have these genuine possibilities on that way of thinking of. So the two things I would say he's kind of begging the question maybe here. I don't know. It's interesting. I haven't thought through these things before, so I'll have to think more carefully about this. All right, let's get through this part, and then, it's getting late already, so maybe we'll have time for one more today, and then see if we can come back. There's still an hour of this. Holy mackerel!
I could see Huemer or someone else responding to these cases by saying, well, when the mountain climber's pinned, we really shouldn't blame him for not hacking off his arm, for just not doing maybe what it seems like in some sense he should do. And maybe what that means is the kind of should in question is going to be really important. So yeah, prudentially, he should hack off his arm. That's what's in his best interest overall. But like morally, should he? Maybe that's a separate question. And then there's, of course, the separate question of whether we should respond by blaming. I think that's a totally separate issue. But this is at least reason to ask, what is the sense of should that's supposed to require alternative possibilities? It looks like prudential should doesn't require alternatives. And honestly, it looks like morally should doesn't require alternative possibilities. You might think, well, maybe you ought to do it, but then if you can't do it, which again, this is going to be something that comes up again later, but maybe we shouldn't blame you if you fail to do the thing that you ought in that case. And that might be right. But again, that's not what he's arguing here. The Arpali case is similar to a case that's widely discussed in the free will literature. Usually people refer to Martin Luther, who when he was asked to recant some of his distinctively anti-Catholic teachings, said no. And he said, here I stand, I can do no other. And a lot of people think Luther's responsible for omitting to recant certain beliefs, but also it's true that he couldn't have done otherwise at that point. But the reason why he's responsible and perhaps free, though he lacks alternatives at that time, is because he did have alternatives earlier on, and he chose to shape himself into the kind of person who couldn't have done otherwise when asked to recant. And maybe that's how it is for the driver who steps on the brakes. They've made themselves such a kind of person that couldn't refrain from stepping on the brakes when there's a pedestrian right in front of them. So maybe another way to kind of respond to these cases would be to go that route and say, well, there's like derivative freedom or derivative responsibility here, and that's why we think it's okay to say that you should step on the brakes in that case. Even still, I think if the person had played no role, had no alternatives earlier on that sort of shaped them into the person who steps on the brakes, if they did it in that case, we would say, oh yeah, they did what they should have, even though they lacked alternatives. So I'm not sure that kind of response would ultimately be helpful for Huemer's case.
Yeah, and if you go to like early agents as well, like agents who are making some of their first decisions for which they are morally responsible, you wouldn't be able to have tracing. So you wouldn't really be able to. Tracing for the audience is basically where we can say that someone is responsible for doing something, even though on that particular occasion they couldn't have done otherwise. Well, the idea is that they're responsible because they did earlier things for which they could have done otherwise, which kind of led to them doing this thing in question. So like one would not be able to appeal to that sort of thing in the cases of early agents. And we might still think that for some of these early agents, they act in accordance with what they have overwhelming moral and prudential reason to do. And they do indeed lack alternative possibilities in so acting, and yet we still would be inclined to say that they did what they should. Like little Jimmy should have, helped his friend little Timmy when little Timmy scraped his knee or something like that, or whatever. Even though this is one of his first actions, and he is just so brought up that he couldn't have done otherwise. But he's still doing what he should have done, and he's etc. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting rejoinder there, and I like the pushback on behalf of Huemer. But and again, all I need here is that I'm not conceptually confused. I'm not conceptually confused in making that judgment.
Right.
I don't even need to claim that my judgment is true in order to respond to Huemer's case here. So that's another thing. Okay, so we just covered the normative judgments about should and ought. What about has a reason to judgments? Like S has a reason to phi. Does that presuppose the presence of alternative possibilities? I guess I'll say something here. Like for precisely the reasons that we've just given, that seems kind of implausible to me. Like it just might seem obvious in the preceding cases that you have excellent reason to chop off your arm, right? And that you have excellent reason to step on your brakes. And like especially epistemic reasons don't seem to presuppose alternative like possibilities for your beliefs. I think that 1 + 1 = 2, but I couldn't think otherwise or anything like that, right? Or like I think that everything is self-identical, and I just can't think otherwise. So
reason talk is really hard to parse, so I don't have anything to say about that.
And of course, also, if we accept our judgments that you should chop off your arm, well, that very fact seems to imply some reason to do it, right? Like should judgments seem to be tied to reason judgments. Like it would sound odd to say that you should do something even though you have no reason whatsoever to do it. So anyway, that's some of my takes on the reason point. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything to add there. I guess I'll just mention that, again, even if it's like you need to think you have alternative possibilities in order to, see yourself as having a reason to do a particular action, that doesn't require the metaphysical alternatives. It doesn't require, genuine access to alternatives. It just requires what I'm calling epistemic alternatives.
Awesome. And then the final thing here is acting rightly and wrongly. Does that presuppose the presence of alternative possibilities? Now, here I actually think we could introduce a Frankfurt case, because we might think that in Frankfurt cases, someone does something wrong, say, but yet they didn't have alternative possibilities. So actually, I'll turn it over to you to spell out what are Frankfurt cases.
Yeah, so named after Harry Frankfurt, who recently passed away, really influential philosopher, especially on the free will debate, but in other areas of philosophy as well. Wrote a paper that got published in the Journal of Philosophy in 1969 called Moral Responsibility and Alternate Possibilities. I might have reversed the order of those conjuncts, but anyway, gave a case that a lot of people cite nowadays as undermining what's sometimes called the principle of alternative possibilities, which is just that to be morally responsible, you have to have been able to do otherwise, something along those lines. This is different from the acting rightly or wrongly point that we're going to talk about now, but it's closely related. But anyway, in the case that Frankfurt gave, an agent does something, I think they do an action in Frankfurt's case, but nowadays people usually make it a choice. So choosing between A and B, they make a choice to A for their own reasons, seems like they're morally responsible for it. Now, what's happening in the background, which the agent is unaware of, but we are as the audience, is that there was this, say, neuroscientist who had inserted a chip in the agent's brain. And the neuroscientist is able to do two things. One, monitor the agent's deliberation kind of up to the time of the choice. And then second, the neuroscientist is able to press a button, a kind of remote control device that would activate the chip and override the agent's decision, like make them choose A rather than B or B rather than A. And so what's going on, the reason why the neuroscientist has put the chip in the brain with these abilities is the neuroscientist really wants the agent to make the choice to A. And so as the neuroscientist is monitoring the agent's deliberations, if there's any sign that the agent's going to go for B, the neuroscientist will press the button. But as it happens, the neuroscientist doesn't have to intervene because there's no sign that the agent's going to choose B. The agent chooses A on their own. There's no intervention by the neuroscientist. So sometimes people refer to this neuroscientist as a counterfactual intervener because they don't actually intervene in the course of things. So that's the case. And it's supposed to call into question the idea that moral responsibility requires alternative possibilities because it looks like the agent is responsible for choosing to A, and it looks like the agent couldn't have done otherwise given the presence of this counterfactual intervener. Now, there's a whole debate about Frankfurt cases. It's one of my favorite debates. Some people get tired of this debate, but it's a really important debate for thinking about free will and moral responsibility. I think there's room for further debate about whether these cases really do undermine the principle of alternative possibilities. But at the very least, they show that you could have this semi-compatibilist view, or this view that emphasizes source freedom, takes it to be compatible with determinism, even if determinism precludes leeway freedom. So I really like Frankfurt cases because I think they're compelling, and they make my life as a compatibilist a lot easier, to use a phrase from Carolina Sartorio, who's done a lot of work defending Frankfurt cases too. Now, really quick, and then I'll let you interject here, but we're interested in this question of whether, saying someone acted rightly or wrongly requires alternative possibilities. Whether or not you think Frankfurt cases succeed in showing, that PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities, is false, it does look, in that case where the agent can't do otherwise, if that's what's really going on in the case, it's at the very least it's at least possible to say that they did the right thing or they did the wrong thing. Suppose that choosing to A was choosing, I think you had it voting for Lincoln over Hitler, right? So choosing to B would have been choosing, to vote for Hitler. Yeah, they did the right thing. Were they morally responsible for it? You might think, well, no, because they lacked alternative possibilities. But at the very least, we could say, well, they did the right thing. They made the right choice. And again, no conceptual confusion there, it seems.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just I've described these Frankfurt cases already in my when I was anticipating this. I guess I didn't know they did this, but my take on this has always been that it's been a bit of a weird development because you clearly did have the ability to do otherwise in the Frankfurt cases. It's built in because if you had chosen differently, the neuroscientists would have intervened. So you had this seemingly ability to do otherwise. You couldn't have actually done it though because there's this outside force. But you could have made the choice, or at least attempted to, or something like that. So that seems like I don't know if anyone's ever really addressed that in my looking around here in this. All right, so let's just finish this up because I'm gonna have to pause this and then jump back into this a little bit.
What I was going to add. So you completely anticipated that. Now, I do want to cover at least here one of the most prominent objections to it because I know you have published interesting and like some pretty forceful stuff in response to this objection. So it's like the flicker of freedom response. So I think the basic idea here is that, well, we need to be very careful about what we're saying the agent is responsible for. And again, this is a response on behalf of the incompatibilist. They were basically saying, well, the agent is indeed responsible for choosing on their own to act as they did, and they did have leeway with respect to that. They could have chosen on their own, or they could have, it's hard to say the alternative, omitted to choose on their own maybe, and the the counterfactual intervener could have came in and made them not choose on their own or whatever. So like the person did indeed have an alternative possibility open to them, and so it's not the case to say that they didn't have leeway, and so we don't have a counterexample to the view that leeway is required for moral responsibility. Anyway, you can set up the flicker freedom thing maybe better than I can, but I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, you set it up very well. The basic idea is just that, like, well, even in the Frankfurt case, there are two ways things could go. Either the agent could choose to A on their own, as actually happened, but there's this alternative where the agent doesn't do that. They don't choose to A on their own. They do it because the counterfactual intervener, the neuroscientist, pressed the button and made them do it. And so the flicker of freedom theorist who wants to defend alternative possibilities, that conception of moral responsibility, says, well, that's enough for the agent to count as morally responsible and having alternatives in a Frankfurt case. And so Frankfurt cases aren't successful kind of counterexamples to PAP.
Interesting.
To make it seem like that alternative possibility is a relevant one, I've argued, others have argued, including John Maynard Fisher, has argued that the alternative possibility has to be robust in the sense that it has to be an alternative where the agent is responsible for going that way rather than the other. Otherwise, it looks like it can't play the right kind of role in grounding the agent's freedom in the actual sequence. Right? It can't explain why they were free in terms of having alternative possibilities if the alternative was just a sort of fluke. It wasn't something that was up to them. It wasn't something they were free and responsible for choosing. So, and you already mentioned this, Joe. Some flicker theorists like Justin Capes and Philip Swenson argue that the agent's alternative is robust in a Frankfurt case because whether they decide on their own or whether they omit to decide on their own is up to them. That is something that they're free and responsible for. And so in some of my work, I think this is one of the places where it gets very, very subtle. But this is one of the places where I think there is room for further debate, and it is happening. I don't think that the agent's omission to choose to A on their own, I don't think that that's something that they're responsible for in the alternative sequence or something that they do freely. And so I don't think that that's a robust alternative. And so I think there's still, the flicker theorist owes us a story of how that could be robust alternative.
Is that because they don't meet certain like epistemic conditions or what? Like why is that?
Yeah, I think the main thing, this is the thing I'm most kind of compelled by, is that they don't meet the epistemic condition on responsibility, if that's a distinct condition from the sort of freedom condition on responsibility. The agent in a Frankfurt case is not aware of the neuroscientist at all, or the fact that they have the chip in their brain. Right? This is very advanced technology, right? They don't even have any kind of headache or anything from this surgery that they recently had. They are not thinking, oh, either I'm going to choose to A on my own, or this guy's going to press a button and make me do it. And so I'm not going to do it on my own. I'm going to make him force me to do it. That's not how the agent's thinking of it, right? All they're thinking is, should I do it, or should I choose to A, or should I choose to B? It turns out choosing to B is not a genuine alternative for them. It's not metaphysically open. It is an epistemic alternative, and so they're weighing the choice to A and choice to B. But when they choose to A on their own, they're not thinking about this neuroscientist at all. And so the omission to choose to A on their own does not meet the typical conditions on responsibility, even for omissions. In typical cases of omissions, like when some horrible person, I'm not going to put myself in this scenario, but some horrible person sees a child drowning in, you know, a shallow pond and omits to jump in and save the child, right? They're aware of what's going on, of the alternatives, and they're, at least the epistemic alternatives, and they're making a decision in light of those. That's not what's happening in a Frankfurt case. The agent is not aware of the genuinely open alternative, if there is one.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Awesome.
hard to
So
see why that would matter, but yeah, I don't want to get too distracted.
we went over the flicker
but
freedom
it's
thing, and then we
interesting.
went
I
over
didn't
one
know
of the
about this
primary
whole
responses
debate.
to that, which is basically like, well, hey, I mean, like, if leeway really is required for moral responsibility, if these alternative possibilities are really required, well, then like the alternative possibility should be like relevant to explaining my freedom in the
Yeah.
actual world. It's just like partly ground it. But it can only do that if I could like freely and responsibly go down that alternative path. But that's
Right.
not the case for the relevant alternative and that the flicker of freedom people are proposing. So that's kind of like the response. Okay, so of course, for the audience, the dialectic could be traced further, and there are further responses and counter responses and
Right.
so on. But I did just want to trace out the dialectic there because I think it's really fascinating, and I like it. I think it's interesting, and some, you know, you can see like the plausibility of moves on both sides. So like, anyway, I like it.
Right.
But let's move on to the kind of reactive attitudes for Huemer. So let's go back. Well, let's move on to Huemer's thing.
Also, people's
Well, let's. Yeah, this is a good place to pause, and I'll come back for part 3.